The wind off the Atlantic carried a salt-sharp chill that night, a restless current rattling the rusted flagpole outside Ashworth High. Elliot Graves pulled the hood of his cashmere sweatshirt tighter as he crossed the empty parking lot, the soles of his sneakers striking wet pavement with impatient snaps. He should have been home. His mother's townhouse in Beacon Harbor had a fire lit and a chef-prepared dinner waiting, but the silence there always felt heavier than the storm gathering over the bay. A single security light flickered near the back entrance of the school. He tried the door, half hoping it would be locked so he'd have an excuse to turn around. It gave way with a groan. Inside, the hallway smelled of lemon polish and rain seeping through old bricks. The world shrank to the hum of fluorescent bulbs and the steady drip of water from his jacket. Elliot exhaled, long and deliberate, and let the echo fill the corridor. That's when he heard it, soft humming, low and warm, like a song meant to comfort the walls themselves. He followed the sound past the trophy case and down the east wing until he saw her, a woman in a faded navy uniform, pushing a mop in slow, deliberate arcs. Her hair, silver-threaded chestnut, was pulled into a neat knot. She looked up, eyes clear as winter morning. "You're out late," she said, voice calm but carrying. Elliot straightened. "Couldn't sleep." "Couldn't or wouldn't?" A hint of a smile curved her mouth. He opened his own but found no answer worth speaking. She nodded toward the storm-streaked windows. Sometimes the world is loudest when everyone else has gone home. He frowned, unsure why a janitor's words landed heavier than the lectures of every polished teacher he'd ever ignored. The next morning he was back, though he told himself it was only because he'd forgotten a textbook. She was there again, rinsing buckets beneath the harsh glow of industrial lights. "You ever notice," she said without turning, "how silence is a kind of language? Most people don't bother to learn it." Elliot lingered at the doorway. "Do you always talk like that?" "Only when someone's listening." She looked up, eyes steady. "Name's Clara Hart." "Elliot," he said before he could remember not to care. "Elliot," she repeated, as if testing the weight of it. "Do you know what the poet Mary Oliver once wrote? Attention is the beginning of devotion. You look like someone who's forgotten how to pay attention." The word snagged something inside him he didn't know was frayed. Days blurred. Classes remained tedious, his father's messages curt and transactional, his mother's absence a silent room in his chest. But each pre-dawn hour with Clara felt different, like stepping into a pocket of air untouched by the noise of wealth or expectation. She never lectured. She asked, "What do you see when you read this line? How does the quiet make you feel? What would you write if no one ever graded it?" Elliot found himself scribbling thoughts in a battered notebook she'd handed him, thoughts he'd never risked saying aloud. How the ocean at night looked like a black glass secret. How his father's praise felt like a contract. How loneliness could taste metallic, like biting a penny. Clara read every page without flinching. "You're not empty," she told him one morning as dawn bled pale over the gym roof. "You're just waiting to hear your own voice." By the third week he'd stopped pretending these visits were accidental. One evening, rain drumming steady on the roof, he asked, "You used to teach, didn't you?" Clara set the mop aside. "Literature and philosophy. University of Vermont." "What happened?" "A truth bigger than the people in charge," she said simply. "They offered silence. I offered honesty. Honesty doesn't pay tenure." He let the weight of that settle between them. It was in these quiet hours that Elliot began to notice others, too. Naomi Brooks from his history class, paint-smudged sleeves, a sketchbook always half hidden, stopped him in the hall one afternoon. "You've been different," she said, tilting her head. "Less armored." He almost laughed, but her brown eyes held no judgment, only curiosity. Without knowing why, he asked if she liked early mornings. "Only when they mean something," she replied. The next day, she joined him and Clara in the East Wing, her presence a soft warmth that made the dim hallway feel like the beginning of a sunrise. The next morning, Elliot arrived earlier than usual, the air biting at his cheeks and the pavement still slick from last night's rain. He carried his notebook like a talisman, its edges frayed, pages already scribbled with thoughts and half-formed reflections. Clara Hart was already there, the mop in gentle motion, sweeping in perfect arcs that seemed to echo her calm rhythm. She glanced up as he stepped inside. "You're early," she said, voice steady but not judgmental. I wanted to finish something before classes start," Elliot muttered, shifting his weight. Clara didn't comment. Instead, she tilted her head, a small gesture that somehow carried more patience than 100 teachers combined. "Do you remember the line from yesterday's reading?" she asked. "The one about attention being the beginning of devotion?" Elliot nodded. He had read it over and over, underlining words, circling phrases. "I think I understand it now. Not just reading words, but noticing them. Feeling them." Clara's eyes softened. "Exactly. Attention transforms ordinary moments. That's the kind of devotion that changes people, quietly, without fanfare." It struck him then how little of his life had ever been about noticing anything. Everything had been about moving fast, winning, keeping up appearances. Even his wealth had been a kind of armor, a way to hide from the fear of being seen for who he really was. By midweek, Elliot found himself lingering longer, sitting cross-legged on the tile floor while Clara cleaned around him. They didn't speak constantly. Often, she simply hummed, and the silence became a kind of lesson in itself. He wrote in his notebook, observations, questions, reflections, his own voice finally finding room to breathe. It wasn't long before others began to notice the change. Naomi, who had once avoided interaction with most students, started showing up after her shifts at the cafe. She brought a sketchbook and joined silently, sketching the sunlight spilling through the high windows as Clara guided Elliot through passages from classic literature. At first, she didn't speak much, letting the words and atmosphere do the work. But gradually, she shared quiet insights, connections she noticed in stories, parallels to their own lives. Elliot felt something unfamiliar: community. Not forced or superficial, but organic, formed around shared curiosity and quiet kindness. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. His father, James Graves, remained a looming presence. Messages arrived with clipped imperatives: grades? College applications? Do not squander the opportunities one provide. Each note made Elliot's chest tighten, but he learned to read them differently. They were not just commands, they were mirrors of his own fear of failure. He could choose to let them crush him, or he could use them to sharpen his resolve. One evening, after a long session of reading and discussion, Elliot closed his notebook and leaned back, exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. Clara had paused in her work, observing him. "You're tired," she said simply. "I am," he admitted. "But I feel alive for the first time in a long time." Clara placed her mop aside, leaning against the handle. "Good. That's what it feels like when the world starts teaching you. It's exhausting, because you're breaking old habits. But it's necessary. You can't build a new self on a broken foundation without discomfort." Elliot nodded slowly. He realized she was right. Every sarcastic remark he had ever flung at teachers, every ignored assignment, every act of defiance, it had all been scaffolding to hide vulnerability. Now, under her guidance, he was dismantling that scaffolding brick by brick. Naomi stayed later than usual one night, glancing at Elliot's notebook as he scribbled reflections on a passage about moral courage. "Why do you write so much?" she asked, curiosity softening her tone. "Because I need to," Elliot said honestly. "I've spent so long pretending I knew who I was. Turns out I didn't. Writing is the only way I can figure it out." She smiled faintly, almost shyly. "I feel the same. Painting, it's the only place I can really say something about the world that anyone will notice. But it feels fragile. Writing feels solid. Elliot studied her, realizing how easy it had become to trust her, how much her quiet determination mirrored his own growing resolve. But not all transformations went unnoticed. Rumors began circulating through the school, students whispering about the strange boy who hangs out with the janitor and the painter. Some were curious, others sneering. A video even surfaced on social media, Elliot and Clara in the dimly lit hallway, notebooks open, voices low but full of intensity. The caption read, "Lessons from a loser?" Elliot saw it, showed no visible reaction, and returned to his notebook. Clara, noticing his lack of response, nodded approvingly. "You're learning," she said softly. "You don't measure your worth by the shallow opinions of others." He absorbed that, letting it settle like warm rain. The lesson was more important than the ridicule. One afternoon, Clara handed Elliot a worn paperback with blue binding. The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. She said, "This saved me when I lost everything. Now it's your turn to see what it can teach." Elliot took the book with reverence, the margins filled with her careful annotations. Each note, each question, demanded more than passive reading, it demanded reflection, empathy, courage. He started journaling not only his thoughts but also his feelings, anger, fear, hope, and the small sparks of joy that he had thought were lost to him forever. It became ritual, early mornings, evenings after school, long walks along the foggy pier where he'd read aloud to himself what he learned. Naomi often joined, sketching quietly, sometimes reading lines he had written, offering gentle interpretations. The three of them formed an unspoken pact of curiosity and kindness, a hidden sanctuary inside the walls of an ordinary high school. Elliot began noticing people differently. A classmate who always ate lunch alone, he offered a small conversation. A teacher who had been ignored for years, he stayed after class to discuss ideas. Even his father's cold messages no longer intimidated him, they were simply facts, not verdicts. The quiet revolution was not visible to the world outside the hallways and library. It didn't need to be. Its power lay in its subtlety, in the cumulative effect of consistent attention and thoughtfulness. And as Elliot discovered, there was love in the act of noticing, in the act of caring without expectation. The morning air was crisp and heavy with the scent of the sea, fog curling around street lamps like silent whispers. Elliot walked to school with his notebook clutched against his chest. His coat was buttoned all the way up, but it didn't matter, the warmth came from inside, from a spark he hadn't known existed until Clara had nudged it awake. He passed the familiar halls, lined with marble trophies and glossy plaques, but no longer did they intimidate him. The whispers of students, the snickers at his expense, he heard them, but they did not touch him. He was no longer a boy defined by his father's wealth or the shallow perception of his classmates. Naomi joined him near the library entrance, sketchbook under her arm. "You're early," she said. Her voice carried the same gentle humor that had first drawn him to notice her presence. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Or maybe I just couldn't stay still knowing there's work to be done." Her eyes softened. "I get that. There's something alive in these mornings." He nodded, feeling the truth in her words. The secret sessions with Clara were no longer solitary. Slowly, word spread, quietly, like a whisper riding the wind. A few students sought permission, though none of them expected anything revolutionary. They came hesitant, notebooks and pencils in hand, hearts heavy with unspoken worries, thinking they would sit and be taught, but soon realizing that they were to notice, reflect, and participate. Elliot became a guide, not a teacher. Clara never relinquished authority, but she allowed him to encourage, to ask questions, to help his peers confront what they had never spoken aloud. Each session became a sanctuary, a place where kindness was practiced quietly but felt expansively. It was Naomi who first voiced it aloud one day, this feels like more than a study session. It's like it's building something we didn't know we needed." Clara nodded, a quiet smile playing at her lips. "That's because it is." Elliot realized he could no longer imagine mornings without the calm, the learning, the small but powerful acts of noticing the world around him. Outside the sanctuary of the library, the world was still harsh. Teachers continued to judge him for past behavior, classmates occasionally mocked him, and his father remained a distant force of authority. A text from James Graves blinked on his phone one morning. "Report cards are in. Don't disappoint." Elliot stared at the message, his chest tightening. But for the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt resolve. He had spent weeks building knowledge, empathy, and awareness. This was not about pleasing anyone. It was about understanding who he could be. He responded simply, "I'm learning. Truly learning." And left the phone face down. The first real challenge came unexpectedly. During a history class, Elliot raised his hand, something he had rarely done, and asked, "Why does the textbook reduce certain events to a sentence, as if the pain of people doesn't deserve more?" The classroom fell silent. His teacher, Mr. Henderson, a man known for precision and control, paused mid-lecture. "Where did you?" he stammered. Elliot's voice was calm, steady, not arrogant. "I've been reading, reflecting, and noticing things that textbooks ignore. I think we owe it to ourselves, and to history, to pay attention." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, curious. Naomi gave a small nod from the back row, her eyes proud. It was a small moment, but it carried weight. For Elliot, it was proof that change, no matter how quiet, could ripple outward. At home, confrontation was inevitable. James Graves had learned of the sessions through whispers and videos. He cornered Elliot one evening in the study, the walls lined with law books and the smell of polished oak surrounding them. "You're wasting time," he said sharply. "This is not what I expect from my son. You should be preparing for college applications, internships, building connections, not this." Elliot held his father's gaze. "No. I'm preparing to be someone who matters. Not because of your approval or our name, but because of what I choose to do." James' jaw tightened, fury and disbelief warring. "You think this will make you better than me? Smarter than the world?" "No," Elliot replied. "It will make me real. That's better than being smarter than anyone else." The silence that followed was heavy. James finally walked away, leaving Elliot with a strange, trembling sense of triumph. He hadn't defied with cruelty or arrogance, he had defied by choosing authenticity. The sessions grew bolder. Naomi began reading passages aloud, her voice steady, her sketches reflecting the emotions in the texts. Students who had once sat alone were drawn to the library by curiosity and the quiet intensity of Elliot's transformation. Each week, Elliot wrote reflections not only about books but about kindness, about empathy, about seeing people who were invisible to others. The act of noticing became a practice, a meditation, a rebellion against superficiality. Even Clara, who had seen thousands of students come and go, remarked one day, "You're teaching them more than you know." Not with answers, but with honesty. And Elliot realized she was right. The lesson was not the books. It was the courage to engage with the world, to care, to be vulnerable, and to spread kindness without expectation of reward. One rainy afternoon, the administration intervened. The principal, flanked by 2 assistants, entered the library while Elliot and a small group of students were gathered. "Mr. Graves," she said, voice careful but firm, "these sessions are not part of the curriculum. You're violating school policy. You need to stop immediately." Clara stood beside him, calm but resolute. "We are not violating anything. We are helping students think, feel, and grow. Isn't that what education is supposed to do?" The principal hesitated, unsure how to respond. The students remained silent, watching, waiting, hearts pounding with the tension of defiance and support. Elliot stepped forward. "If stopping means ignoring people who need guidance, then we won't stop." Not because we're disobedient, but because kindness is stronger than fear. A murmur ran through the students. Naomi's hand found his. Clara's eyes held steady. And in that moment, Elliot realized that the true measure of courage was not in facing storms outside, but in standing for what was right despite fear. The following week, Ashworth High felt different. The hallways were the same, lockers clanging, sneakers scraping tile, but Elliot walked through them differently, head held not in arrogance, but in awareness. Students who had once whispered now paused to meet his eyes. Some offered tentative smiles, others smirked, trying to test if the old ego had returned. Elliot noticed them all, without judgment. The sessions with Clara continued, now expanding beyond him and Naomi. Quietly, 3 more students joined, drawn by curiosity and the undeniable shift in the library's atmosphere. They came for knowledge, but they stayed for the kindness. And Elliot was beginning to understand the gravity of that word. Kindness was not soft or passive, it was transformative, demanding courage, patience, and unwavering consistency. One evening, after a long session discussing Baldwin and Morrison, Naomi lingered beside him. "You've changed," she said softly. "I'm still me," Elliot replied, "just someone more aware." Her eyes glimmered. "You're brave." He chuckled, brushing it off, but the warmth of her words lingered. Something deeper was forming, quiet, unspoken, tethered to trust and shared struggle. Then came the test. The school's board had heard whispers, rumors about the secret sessions. Parents were concerned, questioning why a janitor was guiding students. The principal, uncertain, tried to mediate, warning Clara and Elliot that the sessions might be suspended. Elliot felt a familiar surge of defiance, tempered now by understanding. He didn't want to fight for ego or pride, he wanted to fight for what mattered. "We're not breaking rules," he told the board one afternoon, voice steady, echoing through the small conference room. "We're teaching students to see the world. To feel. To reflect. Is that not what education should be?" The room was silent. Some members shifted uncomfortably, others glanced at their notes, unwilling to respond. Naomi squeezed his hand quietly under the table. Clara stood beside him, a pillar of calm strength. And in that moment, Elliot realized something he had never understood before: courage was contagious. It spread quietly, but it was undeniable. Word of Elliot's courage traveled beyond the library. Teachers who had once dismissed him began asking to observe, curious about the method. Students who had mocked now sought guidance, quietly participating, quietly learning. The secret circle had become a silent revolution, one rooted in kindness and awareness rather than rules and authority. At home, James Graves sent a terse email, demanding Elliot cease the sessions and focus on conventional metrics of success. Elliot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened his notebook, wrote reflections on integrity, on standing for the unseen, on the weight of small acts that could shift the world. When he finally responded, it was not with anger or rebellion, but with clarity: "I am learning. Not for your approval, not for fame or wealth. I am learning to matter in a way the world can feel. And someday, I will use that to help others." He didn't send it for validation. He sent it because it was true. Then came the moment he had been building toward, quietly, day by day. The community announced a student showcase, an event to celebrate talent, essays, art, and projects. Elliot submitted a series of reflections, essays on empathy, small kindnesses, and the power of noticing. Naomi contributed sketches inspired by his words. Clara offered guidance, but never stepped into the spotlight. When the event began, Elliot felt the familiar pang of nerves. Parents, teachers, and peers gathered, chatter filling the room. He took the stage, holding his notebook. He glanced at Naomi in the front row, her hand resting lightly on his, and Clara near the back, her presence calm and reassuring. He began to read, not from memory, but from the heart. His voice was steady, each word deliberate. For years, I believed that wealth and status were enough. That I could move through life invisible, armored in arrogance. But I was wrong. Real strength, real change, comes from noticing, caring, and acting. It comes from kindness. Not the kind of kindness that expects reward, but the kind that persists in quiet, in consistency, in love. I have learned that every person who feels unseen, every voice that is silenced, every heart that carries hidden burdens, these are the ones who teach us the greatest lessons. And if we take the time to see them, to acknowledge them, and to act with compassion, the world changes, one small act at a time. The room was silent. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, applause erupted, not the polite clapping of obligation, but genuine, heartfelt recognition. Faces brightened, eyes glistened, and Elliot realized that the impact of his quiet labor had reached far beyond the library walls. Naomi squeezed his hand, and he felt warmth spread from chest to fingertips. Clara's eyes were wet, but her smile was steady. The storm that had once raged inside Elliot had quieted. Not because the world had changed, but because he had. Wealth, status, and expectation no longer defined him. He had found something more: purpose, empathy, love, and the courage to act, quietly but persistently. In the weeks that followed, the sessions continued openly, embraced by the administration and students alike. Elliot's reflections were published in the school magazine. Naomi's sketches accompanied his words. Clara remained, ever the guide, ever the quiet force of wisdom and kindness. Elliot no longer sought validation from his father. James Graves visited once, silently observing the transformed students and the library now alive with discussion, reflection, and laughter. He said nothing, but Elliot could feel acknowledgement in the quiet way a proud parent sometimes shows it, through presence rather than words. Years later, Elliot stood at a podium far from Ashworth High, addressing a community of students, teachers, and parents. He spoke of the power of kindness, of empathy, and of noticing the small details in people's lives that often go unseen. Naomi stood beside him, now a colleague and lifelong friend, and Clara Hart, though retired, sat proudly in the front row. He remembered the nights of rain, the early mornings, the quiet library sessions, and the moment he first realized that true power comes from love and courage, not status or wealth. If we each take a moment to truly see one person, to act with compassion without expectation, the world can change. Not overnight. Not with grand gestures. But slowly. Quietly. Consistently. That is how we make a difference. That is how we live with purpose. That is how we matter. The audience rose in applause, and Elliot, for the first time in his life, felt complete. He had inherited no empire, no fortune, no title, but he had gained something far greater, a life defined by kindness, courage, and love that changed not only himself but everyone around him. And in that moment, he knew the truth Clara had taught him so long ago: the world's greatest power resides not in wealth, not in status, but in small, steady acts of love.